Module 67, Depressive and Bipolar Disorders. If you're like most high school students at some point during the year, or especially college students at some point during the year, more likely the dark months of winter than the bright days of summer, you probably experience some of depression's symptoms. You might feel really discouraged about the future, you might feel dissatisfied with your life, maybe socially isolated, you might lack energy to get things done, or even fail to be able to get yourself out of bed. In one survey of American high school students, 29% felt so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row that they stopped doing some usual activities. In another national survey of American college students, 31% agreed that asked if in the past year they had at some time felt so depressed it was difficult to function, and they said yes. Misery has more company than we suppose. Although phobias are really common, depression is the #1 reason people seek mental health services. At some point during their lifetime, depression plagues about 12% of Canadian adults and 17% of U.S. adults. Moreover, it's the leading cause of disability worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. In any given year, a depressive episode plagues 5.8% of men and 9.5% of women. As anxiety is a response to the threat of future loss, depressed mood is often a response to past or current loss. About 1 in 4 people diagnosed with depression is debilitated by a significant loss, such as a loved one's death, a ruptured marriage, a lost job, some other perceived failure. Recall that biologically speaking, life's purpose is not really happiness, but actually survival and reproduction. So coughing, vomiting, swelling, and pain protect the body from really dangerous toxins. Similarly, depression is a sort of like psychic hibernation. It slows us down. It diffuses aggression. It helps us let go of unattainable goals and restrains risk-taking. To grind temporarily to a halt and ruminate, as depressed people do, is to kind of reassess one's life when feeling threatened and to redirect energy, in the best outcomes anyway, in a more promising way. Major depressive disorders. Major depressive disorders occur when at least 5 signs of depression last for 2 or more weeks. To sense what major depression feels like, suggest some clinicians, imagine combining the anguish of grief with the sluggishness of like a really bad jet lag. And that's what it can feel like to some people. I'll show you the DSM in just a moment, but generally speaking, you have problems regulating your appetite. You're either not hungry at all, or you eat to calm and quell your anxiety. You either sleep too much or can't really sleep at all. Oftentimes you have low energy, you have lethargy, you're lethargic. You have low self-esteem, you ruminate and assume that nobody likes you or nobody wants you around. It's difficult to actually make decisions and follow through, and there's definitely a feeling of hopelessness. Adults diagnosed with persistent depressive disorder, also called dysthymia, experience a mildly depressed mood more often than not for at least 2 years. They also display 2 of the following symptoms: either problems regulating their appetite, problems regulating sleep, low energy, low self-esteem, difficulty concentrating, or feelings of hopelessness, just like the above symptoms of major depressive disorder. This is especially problematic in the years that you're experiencing right now and in the years to come. Unfortunately, what coincides oftentimes, certainly not all the time, but oftentimes with a move out of the house into the college setting is far more independence, exposure to drugs and alcohol, and depending upon your situation, maybe a lack of experience in regulating that for yourself. Here's the DSM for major depressive disorders. So notice that you have to have at least 5 of these symptoms over a 2-week period, and it must impair your kind of day-to-day life. With or without therapy, episodes of major depression usually end and people temporarily or permanently return to their previous behavior patterns. However, some people rebound to or sometimes start with the opposite emotional extreme, a euphoric, hyperactive, wildly optimistic state of mania. If depression is moving in slow motion, mania is like fast forward. Alternating between depression and mania from week to week, not day to day usually, or moment to moment, are signals of a possibility of a bipolar disorder. Adolescent mood swings from rage to bubbly can, when prolonged, produce a bipolar diagnosis. Between 1994 and 2003, the U.S. National Center for Health Statistics annual physician surveys revealed an astonishing 40-fold increase in diagnoses of bipolar disorder in those 19 and under. The new popularity of the diagnosis, given in 2/3 of the cases to boys, has been a boon to companies whose drugs are prescribed to lessen mood swings, which is also something to think about and consider. The DSM will likely reduce the number of child and adolescent bipolar diagnoses by classifying as disruptive mood dysregulation disorder some of those with emotional volatility. During a manic phase, people with bipolar disorder are typically overtalkative, overactive, they're elated, though easily irritated, have little need for sleep, show fewer sexual inhibitions. Often the speech is loud, flighty, it's hard to interpret, they find advice irritating, yet they need protection from their own poor judgment, which may lead to reckless spending or unsafe sex practices. In some cases, bipolar disorder has been linked to creativity. So, for example, along the bottom, I think you might be cut off in your in the recording and the capture. And so this is Catherine Zeta-Jones, Mark Twain, Virginia Woolf, and Tim Burton. All suffer from bipolar disorder. And anyway, in milder forms, that energy and free-flowing kind of thinking can fuel creativity. Handel, a really famous classical composer, suffered from a mild form of bipolar disorder and composed the nearly 4-hour-long Messiah during a 3-week intense creative energy kind of manic phase. A guy named Robert Schumann composed 51 musicals during a 2-year period of mania. Anyway, there are just examples of that. Beethoven, anyway. In thousands of studies, psychologists have been accumulating evidence to help explain mood disorders and suggest more effective ways to treat them. Many behavioral and cognitive changes accompany depression. So oftentimes people feel trapped in a depressed mood. They're inactive, they feel unmotivated, they're sensitive to negative happenings. They more often recall negative information. They expect negative outcomes. When the mood lifts, these behavioral and cognitive accompaniments disappear. Nearly half of the time, people also exhibit symptoms of another disorder like anxiety or even substance use disorders. Depression is really widespread. Its commonality suggests that its causes, too, must be very common. Women's risk of major depression is nearly double men's. When Gallup Poll instituted a survey in 2009, they asked more than 250,000 Americans if they'd ever been diagnosed with depression, and 13% of men and 22% of women said they had. This gender gap has been found worldwide. The trend begins in adolescence. Pre-adolescent girls are not more depression-prone than boys, but after that they do seem to be. The factors that put women at risk for depression are genetic predispositions, child abuse, low self-esteem, marital problems, and so forth. Women are more vulnerable to the disorder involving internalized states such as depression, anxiety, and inhibited sexual desire. Men's disorders tend to be more external, like alcohol use disorder, antisocial conduct, lack of impulse control. Okay, we're going to look at this from a biological perspective. So first of all, mood disorders run in families. As one researcher noted, emotions are postcards from our genes. The risk of major depression and bipolar disorder increase if you have a parent or a sibling with the disorder. If one identical twin is diagnosed with a major depressive disorder, the chances are about 1 in 2 that at some time the other twin will also be. If one identical twin has bipolar disorder, the chances are 7 in 10 that the other twin will at some point be diagnosed similarly. The greater similarity amongst identical twins holds even among twins raised apart. Summarizing the major twin studies, one research team estimated the heritability, which is the extent to which individual differences are attributed to genes, of a major depression is 37%. Using modern technology, researchers are also gaining insight into brain activity during depressed and manic states, and into the effects of certain neurotransmitters during those states. Many studies have found diminished brain activity during slowed down depressive states and more activity during periods of mania. The left frontal lobe and an adjacent brain reward center are active during positive emotions, but less active during depressed states. In one study of people with severe depression, MRI scans also found their frontal lobes 7% smaller than normal. Other studies showed that the hippocampus, the memory processing center linked with the brain's emotional circuitry, is vulnerable to stress-related damage. Bipolar disorder likewise correlates with brain structure. Neuroscientists have found structural differences such as decreased axonal white matter or enlarged fluid-filled ventricles in the brains of people with bipolar disorder. Neurotransmitters systems influence mood disorders as well. Norepinephrine, which increases arousal and boosts mood, is scarce during depression and overabundant during mania. Many people with a history of depression also have a history of habitually smoking, and smoking increases one's risk for future depression. This may indicate an attempt to self-medicate with inhaled nicotine, which can temporarily increase norepinephrine and boost the mood. Researchers are also exploring a second neurotransmitter, serotonin. One well-publicized study of New Zealand young adults found that the recipe for depression combined 2 necessary ingredients: significant life stress plus a variation on a serotonin-controlling gene. Depression arose from the interaction of an adverse environment plus a genetic susceptibility, but not from either alone. The story of gene-environment interactions is still being written. This research is ongoing, and the debate of the reliability of the results of that study are still in question. These are the MRI scans that we were just mentioning. In addition to the biological perspective, there's also a social cognitive perspective, which I think will also make a lot of sense to you guys. So from a social cognitive perspective, self-defeating beliefs arise from something called learned helplessness. As we saw earlier in the units that we studied, both dogs and humans act depressed, passive, and withdrawn after experiencing uncontrollable painful events. Learned helplessness is more common in women than in men, and women may respond more strongly to stress in general. For example, 38% of women and 17% of men entering U.S. colleges and universities report feeling at least occasionally overwhelmed by all that they have to do. There's something also called rumination. Rumination, and I think you guys can relate. We have a lot of overthinkers in the room. Rumination is when you have a tendency to overthink or to ruminate. You just kind of keep playing the same thing over and over in your brain. You stay focused on a problem thanks to the continuous firing of a frontal lobe area, which sustains attention, and that can be adaptive. But when it is relentless, self-focused rumination diverts us from thinking about other tasks in life and just puts us in this kind of negative emotional spiral and cycle. So why do life's unavoidable failures lead only some people to become depressed? The answer lies partly in their explanatory style. Who or what they blame for their failures, or credit for their successes. Think of how you might feel if you failed a test. If you externalize the blame, what an unfair test, then you're more likely to feel angry. If you blame yourself, you'll probably feel stupid and depressed. So it is with depressed people who tend to explain bad events in their life in terms that are stable, it's going to last forever, or global, it's going to affect everything I do, or internal, it's all my fault. Depression-prone people respond to bad events in an especially self-focused way.